Another way to solve for the endpoint of a line segment when you're given the midpoint is to use number lines. Okay, so remember, the definition of a midpoint is the middle of the line segment, or you can think of it as cutting it in half, creating two smaller congruent segments. Okay, so what that means is for any given line segment, okay, so here's A, here's B, my midpoint is in the middle, making these the two smaller segments, AM, congruent to BM, so they're the same value. Or you can also think of it as this being the same, that A is the same distance to M as B is to M, and that's where the number line comes in. So, because remember, think of a graph. A graph is simply two number lines. One just happens to be vertical. So essentially, I'm going to take apart my two axes. Okay. And you don't. I mean, you could keep the y axis vertical. I happen to like it writing it out horizontally. So I'm just going to create my number lines based on my values. So if I look at, so point A, 4, -5, the midpoint is -2, -2. Okay, so I'm going to first look at just my x values. Okay, so on a number line with the middle being 0, A is at +4. And my midpoint is at -2. Okay, so the question is, how many units is it from A to M? Well, A to 0 is 4, and 0 to -2 is 2, so from A to M, this is 6 units. And because that midpoint creates the halfway mark of the greater line segment AB, that means that endpoint B must also be 6 units from the midpoint. So what is 6 units from -2? Well, that happens to be -8. And that is what we determined using our midpoint formula. Now all I have to do is do the same thing for y. Now again, if you prefer leaving your y number line vertically, you can. I just prefer it horizontally. And I'm going to do the same thing, just this time with my y values. So A has a y value of -5. And again, the midpoint is at -2. Okay, well, from A to my midpoint, that's 3 units. So that means from my midpoint to endpoint B must also be 3 units. And 3 units from -2 is a +1. And so that would be the y value for coordinate B. So that's how we get -8, 1 as my coordinate for point B.